So our next speaker is here. Ken is a PhD Major General with the USAF, retired. He's an Associate Director of the Bureau of Economic Geology, Jackson School of Geoscience, the University of Texas. He is a geophysicist whose main research is in geothermal energy. So Ken, we'll turn it over to you, sir.
All right. I've got a lot to cover and 25 minutes before your happy hour starts, so I'm going to move quickly. I'll be happy to stick around and answer questions after the fact as needed. So this is, for most of you, except maybe Trey Gerfers and some of the people from on the Water Board, probably the first time you're really getting any information on geothermal energy. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of overview from that. I'll try not to speak in a monotone to put y'all to sleep. I know this is the last talk of the day, but we'll get going. The Bureau, I'm assuming most of y'all are pretty familiar with that. You already heard about me. Okay, the Earth has a lot of heat coming out of it. 47 terawatts of energy flow out of the crust and into space on a continual basis. That's several times our world energy need, but more than that, the upper 10 kilometers, 6 miles of the crust, has several thousand times our current energy needs stored in the rocks. They're a really good heat battery. Geothermal power has been around for about 100 years or so. The US happens to be the biggest producer in the world of geothermal electricity at about 3 gigawatts, but our grid is so big it's less than 0.5% of our grid. Some countries generate 50% of their energy from geothermal. And when I'm talking geothermal, I'm not talking ground return heat pumps for your house. We're talking drilling kilometers or miles into the ground, getting to temperatures of 150 C, 300 F or higher, and using that temperature to generate electricity. It's a low to zero to even slightly carbon negative energy source that is on the cusp of a potential boom here in Texas. That's why I'm here to talk to you today, kind of give you a heads up on what might be coming and what might be the impacts on groundwater. Conventional geothermal is pretty much all the installed capacity in the world right now, and that uses formation fluids, hot fluids in the ground, to generate the electricity. So it brings them up to the surface, flashes, drives a turbine, and produces electricity. The revolution that we're starting to see now that might really open up Texas is called geothermal anywhere, and that drills down for the heat in the rock and specifically looks to avoid formation fluids. So you're just going for hot rock. You then introduce your own fluid flow system to hoover up the heat, bring it up to the surface, and generate electricity. And that potentially opens up any place in the world, including right here under us in San Antonio. The other thing, the key thing, it's base load, unlike wind and solar, which are great, but they're intermittent. Geothermal is 24/7 as an energy source. It's been limited to volcanic areas and such until now with that hydrothermal, because nature has to concentrate the fluid, the hot fluid for you. That's the paradigm we're breaking now to open up all the world's surface to energy production. This is an actual heat map, but think of it as a priority map. Red is hotter ground or crust. The white areas are the coolest. And as the technology has improved, we're opening up more and more of this map to viable economic electricity production. And you can see Texas has some relatively hot areas. Right now, all the geothermal power plants in the US are the Rockies West, but that's close to changing. There are 2 active geothermal leases I know of in Texas right now, one northeast of El Paso, one south of Houston, but there's probably at least half a dozen projects brewing to build geothermal power plants in Texas. Some of them are still in stealth mode, some of them are public and might get a contract let as early as the end of this year. Why is this happening now? Because of advances in oil and gas drilling that make it cheaper and faster, advances in conversion of heat to electricity, and of course, the need to decarbonize our power sources and the climate and the atmosphere. And that's driving, those things coming together are what's driving this revolution now. We're at the cusp of it. The existing hydrothermal, geothermal is a mature industry, still growing, but mature. The geothermal anywhere is an emerging technology and really a fairly separate industry. The advantages, I've already hit the big ones. It's base load, it's low to zero carbon, and build it where you need to. You need to power a campus, a facility, a new neighborhood development, drill a geothermal well right in the middle of it, supply typically a robust rule of thumb is a few megawatts for a good geothermal well, a few megawatts of electricity production. So that's enough to power 1,000 homes. The players are startups. They're really leading this with some support from academics like me, but the academic community in this area is very, very small. They're all making their funding rounds well, and in fact, if you add up their funding rounds, it's generally more than the Department of Energy, their traditional funder spends on geothermal research, and now the big change is the Department of Defense has gotten involved. Something myself and others have been pushing for years. Earlier this year, they had the largest call for new geothermal power plants ever, anywhere in history. That's 6 new power plants at bases around the US, including Joint Base San Antonio, the only one in Texas. And I know they're down to contract negotiations for the prototype plant at this stage. Hopefully a contract will let before the end of the calendar year. So it's a pretty exciting time. I've been in this field since I did my PhD in the 90s in this. Frankly, pretty boring till about 3 years ago. Now, by orders of magnitude, the most exciting time I've seen. Okay, now we get to how it affects potentially the groundwater and such. How do you mine this heat? If you're not tapping a natural flow, you're creating your own. And there's a couple of variations on how to do it. The main two, first one here, you drill 2 parallel wells. They could be horizontal, they could be vertical. You create fractures between them. By the way, a lot less, fracture is even a dangerous word, but it's significantly different than oil and gas fracking. But you flow water in one well, through the fractures where it absorbs the heat, pick it up in the other well, bring it up to the surface, drive your turbine, rinse and repeat indefinitely. Closed loop, that's how you get particularly to low to zero carbon, other than what you might leak off in the fractures up to a certain point. The other main method is to drill a radiator pattern in the ground. So you'll drill a lot of laterals, you'll connect them to get enough surface area in the wellbore to transfer your heat. The drawback to this is you literally need about 100 kilometers of laterals. That's a lot of well. So you have a cost factor there. But that's one of the reasons improvements in the cost of drilling have made this economically viable now. The risk, similar for conventional to oil and gas, you've got to hit a fluid upflow or a fluid zone in the rock. Geothermal anywhere, you're not going to miss. Your target is straight down. You're going to hit high temperatures. The deeper you drive or deeper you drill, the higher it gets. The only question is, will you get to the temperature you want at the depth you expect and in the rock type you want? But since you're not going for the fluid, you're going for the hot rock, you are not going to miss. Here's a blow-up of Texas heat. You can look at this as heat flow. This happens to be temperature at 10 kilometers down or 6 miles down. Don't worry about the scale. The bottom line is if you can get that deep, it's really hot, but that's kind of the moonshot level. Most of the projects that are brewing in Texas are going to be drilling in the 4 to 6 kilometer deep range, so a much more viable range of depths. Been a few issues that kind of relate to what has been mentioned earlier also. Who owns the heat? Well, the legislature did tackle that issue this session and ended up, the assignment is to the surface owner for heat in the rock. Now, heat in the water, I'm not a lawyer, I don't know where that one stands, but heat in the rock goes to the surface. And they cleared up some other things. There was up till the law takes into effect, if you had those 2 well systems, one well would have been regulated by TCQ, one by the Railroad Commission on a single system, which would be a nightmare. Now they're both going to be Railroad Commission. And related to another topic, orphaned wells. The law up till this session said only oil and gas operators could adopt abandoned wells. That now includes geothermal companies. So another possible organization type that would take on abandoned wells. The induced seismicity risk is low. There have actually been test drills that we monitored at the Bureau and observed no seismicity. The aquifer and water drawdown, now that gets to the heart of interest here. It's going to be negligible probably for closed systems, and I'll show you that in a minute. It's moderate to low for the open or hydrothermal systems. So before I get to that detail, these are the members of that Texas Geothermal Energy Alliance, the new industry association, intending to be the geothermal version of Texoga, led by Barry Smitherman and Matt Welch, who's maybe names that some of you will recognize. But you can see the traditional big energy players plus the, some of the new green energy companies too. The IRA has had a big impact. There are billions of dollars in renewable energy in it, credits, and in this case also massive amounts of loans for renewable energy projects. The county by county, I'm not going to go into much detail there, but here, actually I've got a better one to show you here, I think. A little better. This is a map of bottom hole temperatures. These are temperatures we get from oil and gas wells. And a good minimum value temperature that we're looking for in geothermal systems is 150 C or 300 F. That's a big clue in for how deep you're going to be going. For all these systems, we're going to be going well below aquifers, well below. So it boils down to an issue of well completions and monitoring, which was covered very well early on, the issues that arise with that. But for the issue is addressed by very established best practice methods and potential improvements in the future on wells. Now, let me back out another aspect of this. A well-managed geothermal system can have an indefinite lifespan. The oldest one in the world in Larderello, Italy, has been running since 1904. The oldest one in the US, the geysers in California, has been running since 1960. If you manage a system well, it will last indefinitely or nearly indefinitely, which means the operator has a vested interest in keeping the wells in good condition and working them over on a regular basis. I am not personally aware of any abandoned geothermal power plant fields. There probably is some. There have been some projects in Europe that have been shut down, but not necessarily in the US. But you can see this is a fairly typical part of Texas. It happens to be Presidio County and surrounding areas, where we're looking at how deep do you have to go to get to that magic temperature of, in this case, 150 C. And what you can see in that case is 6 kilometers down, or what would that be, about 3.5 miles. So fairly deep we're talking about going. It's oil and gas level deep or deeper, typically. There is also intense interest in reusing old oil and gas fields, but most of them don't really get to the temperatures you need for this purpose. So it's, do you over-drill a well, or is it just better to drill a new well in an existing field because you know the geology really well? Open question on whether old fields can be reused and turned to geothermal, but there is intense interest for a variety of reasons from the operators. Here's just a blow-up of more detail on Presidio, which we've been talking with and are doing research on right now at the Bureau. The business case, just briefly, geothermal has very high upfront costs because half of a project is your drilling, is your well drilling typically. And to justify that, you need a solid power purchase agreement up front, and that's one of the big obstacles. We have completed a study for the Air Force. They spent a little under $1 million over 2 years for us and one of the startups to design a system that would go inside the city limits of Houston at a small field called Ellington Field. Truth in advertising, I used to command that base. But it would be a power plant that would power that base, drilled inside the base, and last a minimum of 30 years, still produce 3 megawatts at the end of 30 years. So that's an example of you can do these things very close in. Let me back up one. The method for this one involves creating a 1 kilometer tall vertical fracture that you circulate water through to extract the heat. But now, the impacts. Okay. There's a broad spectrum of use of geothermal, from generating electricity on one end, the highest temperature end, down to direct use for heating greenhouses on the other end. And that temperature range also gives you a depth range. So I focus on geothermal electricity production or higher end direct use. Those are all pretty deep uses, but you can get in the shallower end, which aquaculture, agriculture uses, and such, which can involve, because they're cooler, shallow aquifers. Now, that's not a big area of interest in the US right now. It is in Europe. Iceland grows huge amounts of food through their horrible winters using geothermal heat. They actually defrost their roads. They've got so much heat from volcanoes. But here, the interest is mostly electricity, so that's very deep or fairly high temperature direct use, because you can use heat to generate air conditioning, which is a big deal here in Texas. So it's really a matter of how deep and what the temperatures are that you're going for determines whether you're going to get anywhere close to aquifers as something you would produce. The closed loop systems, again, very deep, typically multiple kilometers down, and following hopefully good processes for isolating and completing your wells. The one set of systems in the US that could, in Texas, that could be a little bit more of an issue, there's very low hanging fruit in what's called the Gulf geopressure zone. A zone typically about 4 kilometers deep, runs inland parallel to the coast with overpressure. There was a test well done in the late 80s, early 90s by DOE that did produce for 6 months 0.5 megawatt of geothermal off a combination of the pressure and the temperature drive from the Gulf geopressure zone. There is one lease that is kind of looking at that on the south of Texas. The bigger issue here, again, setting aside completing your well as you go through the used aquifers, is potentially a drawdown issue. So this is the one scheme that's pretty much an open loop. You would be producing these elevated temperature reservoirs just like you would an oil and gas field. You'd basically pump it out, produce your electricity, dispose of it, maybe through reinjection somewhere else, but you would be deflating that aquifer. So these might have a subsidence issue. It's something that needs to be modeled before the projects get off the ground in detail, but it's also limited on where you're going to find the right sets of conditions. So those along the coast are a possibility, but frankly, it's a fairly low temperature resource. You're probably going to be better off drilling through those than just doing a closed loop system. But the key advantage here, those can be done with completely existing technology, nothing new needed. And here's another view just to help you kind of get your bearings on this, on the temperature range, because the temperature range equates to the depth range, and so that's what determines what you're going to be doing. And again, for Texas, for the near term anyway, it's going to be focused on electricity production, and that involves the higher temperatures. Now, if you're under cooler areas like Austin, you may have to go to 8 to 10 kilometers. That project in Houston, inside the city limits on the south side, based on the research, we expected to go to between 4.5 and 5 kilometers down to get to 175C, or about, 340F or so. So again, the depth scale is significantly deep. We have formed a research consortium at the Bureau just recently, and that's off and running now. That's one of our main models where we bring industry frenemies together to solve common problems. There is, if you want to know more, free download massive report funded by the Mitchell Foundation. You can just Google Mitchell Foundation Geothermal and get to this report. It's very big, but I assure you it has a really good executive summary. Just read through that if you want to get a starting point on geothermal and Texas. This is not just the engineering and science, it's policy, it's economics, it's environmental impact, and all those areas. So the future of geothermal energy in Texas by the Mitchell Foundation. The Bureau folks, myself and others, wrote about half that report, along with people from other universities and nonprofits in Texas. Other areas, if you want to stay informed in this, Think Geoenergy is a good newsletter, free newsletter. You can just get on their email list. It'll tell you about every geothermal project brewing in the world. It's a very good source. The government office lead is the Geothermal Technology Office at the Department of Energy. The main conferences, Geothermal Rising, which is coming up in a few weeks in Reno. And then Interspace puts on what are called the Pivot Conferences. These are free online conferences. They'll be starting, I think, next week. That'll run for 4 weeks. It's international, but you can Google Pivot Geothermal and get to that, or you can watch the past 3 years' conferences free online on YouTube. That's where pretty much all the new Geothermal Anywhere people gather. And then there's others there that you can see. I'll close with, there is Geothermal in Space too. That's my most recent paper. These are geysers about 100 to 200 kilometers high coming out of one of the moons of Saturn. So there's potential geothermal energy as we expand into space too. So with that, I'll stop, and if there's any time left, I'll take questions, and I'll stick around if anyone's not in a rush for the happy hour. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's give him a great welcome for that. Good job. And I believe we have a quick question here.
I actually have 2 quick questions. So great presentation. In Texas, we have no shortage of fresh water, but we don't have a shortage of saline water, particularly as a byproduct from desalination concentrate. So my first question is, do you know what quality of water is required for geothermal? Like, could we use concentrate? And second, the volume that would be required for, I know it would depend on the plant, but say like a typical, Austin Energy size plant, like what volume of water would be required for that, and can you use a saline source?
Okay, so as far as using formation fluids, mainly going to be applicable in that Gulf Coast region or maybe out near El Paso. The rest of the state's probably going to be closed loop and won't touch formation fluids. Where you do have formation fluids, yes, you can use, well, most of the plants in the U.S. out in the west of the Rockies, they're dealing with fluids that have been in equilibrium with the rock for hundreds or thousands of years at temperatures above 150 C. They are loaded with everything. So you can handle it. It's a major part of the O&M cost of those plants to pre-treat it so that you don't end up depositing scale on all your piping and turbines and such. Now, the other side of the other question is, how much volume do you need? It depends on how hot the source is, and that includes also for the engineered geothermal systems, the Geothermal Anywhere, because you're still going to be using a fluid and you're going to be circulating it through. If you're on the low end of the scale, like 150 C, then you're going to need somewhere between 10 and 40,000 barrels a day, that's the only English unit I use, of fluid flow to generate your electricity per well. If it's 250 C, it'll be far, far less. We're also exploring other fluids. So you might use downhole what's called a binary exchange system, where you use essentially a coolant, an organic molecule, as your downhole system. Or now, the leading edge of research is looking at CO2 as your downhole fluid to soak up the heat. That's how you can technically get to slightly carbon negative if you're locking it up in a closed system. It's not much volume, but technically you're there. So, thank you. Thanks for the question. Others?
Let's talk about repurposing orphaned wells with geothermal. My sense would be that there's going to be a population of orphaned wells or inactive unplugged wells that are not good candidates at all for this kind of technology. But in what cases would an unplugged oil and gas well be a good candidate for geothermal? Are there physical attributes? Is there an age threshold for that cement? What would you look at?
Okay, so what would you do to essentially assess orphaned wells or abandoned wells? It's a tough question. There needs to be, frankly, a lot more research on the subject. I only have a little bit of data point. One thing is oil wells neck down as you go deeper. And actually for that 10 to 40,000 barrels of fluid flow that I was just mentioning, typically the bottom of an oil well is too narrow to handle that. The parasitic drag of friction just skyrockets. So you would have to probably over drill it anyway, or drill deeper. The one test well that was drilled here in Texas, which was in Starr County last year and then re-entered again this year, was using a relatively young and still operator-owned dry gas well. And even on a relatively young well, they encountered, I believe, around $1 million of unexpected workover they had to do. So I am not yet convinced that reusing an old well is going to be economically viable. Again, I go maybe toward, because drilling has improved so much, especially as you get in an older field, 20, 30 years, and I wouldn't even touch one from mid-century. But it might be that it's cheaper and better in other ways to just drill a new well in an old field, because the one thing you've got is you've already got really good knowledge of the rocks. And so that might save you.